The heavy iron key to my grandfather's dacha felt colder than the morning air, biting into the palm of my hand as I gripped it tight. My name is Elias, and exactly 3 weeks ago, I buried the only man who truly knew me. My grandfather was a recluse, a man of shadows and ancient books who spent his final decades tucked away in the deep forests of the countryside, far from the prying eyes of a world he no longer understood. When a lawyer handed me the deed to the Hollow, a sprawling 2-story wooden dacha, I didn't see a burden. I saw an escape. The plan was simple: a weekend away from the suffocating pressure of the city, away from the flickering neon and the endless noise. I invited 5 people, the only world I had left. There was Max, my best friend, a guy who looked at the world through the lens of the occult and the unexplained. He arrived with a rucksack that looked far too heavy for a weekend trip. Then there was Artyom, the life of every party, who showed up with 2 massive crates of beer and a grin that promised trouble. Leo was the quiet one, a tech head who brought his gear but seemed more interested in the eerie silence of the woods. For the girls, we had Sasha, a bold, sharp-tongued photographer, and Elena. Elena was the reason I agreed to this. She was the light I had been chasing for 3 years, a girl with eyes like a storm and a laugh that could shatter the gloom of even the darkest room. As we piled into my old SUV, the trunk groaning under the weight of supplies and alcohol, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the forest would provide the clarity I needed. The drive was long, transitioning from paved highways to gravel roads, and finally to a narrow, matted path of pine needles where the trees grew so thick they seemed to weave their branches together above the car, blocking out the sun. The silence of the forest was absolute. No vert chirpeth, no insects bast. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for us to cross the threshold. Did your granddad ever talk about this place, Elias? Sasha asked, her camera already out, snapping photos of the gnarled, gray trunks passing by. Never, I replied, my eyes fixed on the path. He just called it the place of rest. He said once you go there, the world can't follow you. Sounds like the start of a horror movie. Artyom laughed, cracking open a beer and handing one to Max. A haunted cabin, 6 friends, and enough booze to forget our own names. What could go wrong? Max didn't laugh. He was staring out the window, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass. It's not haunted, Artyom. It's thin. Some places on this earth have less skin than others. You can feel it, can't you? The air tastes like iron. Lay off the creepy talk, Max, Leo muttered from the back seat. You're gonna freak out the girls before we even get the keys in the door. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the road, the dacha finally appeared. It was a massive, weathered structure of blackened timber and heavy stone. 2 stories tall, it loomed over a small clearing like a silent sentry. The windows were dark and reflective, giving the house the appearance of a blind giant watching us from the tall grass. I parked the car, and for a moment, none of us moved. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in a world that felt suddenly very old and very hungry. It's bigger than I thought, Elena whispered, her hand finding mine in the center console. Her skin was ice cold. It's perfect, I said, though my stomach did a slow, uneasy flip. I climbed out of the car, the silence of the woods rushing into my ears like water. I looked at the house, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a pale face flicker behind a 2nd-story window. But when I blinked, it was gone, just a trick of the dying light and the swaying pines. Let's get the stuff inside, Artyom shouted, breaking the tension as he slammed the trunk shut. I want a cold beer and a warm fire before the sun finishes dying. We grabbed our bags and headed toward the heavy oak door. As I slid the key into the lock, I felt a strange vibration, a low hum that seemed to come from the wood itself. I turned the key. The lock groaned. The door swung open on rusted hinges, and we stepped into the darkness of my grandfather's legacy. We didn't know it then, but the place of rest was never meant for the living. The air inside the dacha was stagnant, a thick cocktail of cedar, old paper, and a cold, metallic scent that seemed to emanate from the very walls. As we stepped into the foyer, our flashlights sliced through a darkness so dense it felt like physical ink. The beams danced across the dust motes, revealing a house frozen in time. The furniture was draped in heavy white shrouds, making the living room look like a gathering of ghosts waiting for our arrival. "Check out the size of this place," Leo whispered, his voice disappearing into the high, vaulted ceilings. The second-story balcony loomed over us, a dark wooden ribcage that circled the main hall. We began the tour, our footsteps echoing like gunshots on the ancient floorboards. As we moved into the grand hall, the beam of my flashlight hit the far wall, and Sasha let out a sharp, jagged scream. I swung the light back, and we all froze. Mounted directly above the massive stone fireplace was the taxidermy head of a stag. It was unnaturally large, its antlers sprawling across the timber like a crown of thorns. But it wasn't the size that was wrong, it was the expression. Most taxidermy looks vacant, but this creature looked furious. Its glass eyes were a deep, blood amber, catching our light and reflecting it back with a predatory intensity. The snout was curled back, revealing yellowed teeth that looked more like a wolf's than a deer's. "God, Elias." Artyom breathed, his hand gripping a beer bottle so tight his knuckles were white. "Your granddad was a freak. That thing looks like it's waiting for us to turn our backs." "It's just wooden glass, guys," I said, though my heart was hammering. I could feel the stag's gaze lingering on me even after I moved the light away. We finished the sweep of the ground floor, a kitchen with rusted iron stoves, a study filled with leather-bound books that smelled of rot, and a cellar door that was locked with 3 separate chains. By the time we reached the second floor, the forest outside had completely surrendered to the night. The moon was obscured by thick, churning clouds, leaving the dacha an island of wood in an ocean of black. We decided to head back down to the porch to start the grill. The familiar sizzle of meat and the crackling of wood provided a temporary shield against the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Max and I stood by the grill. The flames cast long, flickering shadows of the trees against the house, making the forest look like it was dancing. Max was silent, staring into the heart of the coals. "Elias," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "I didn't just bring beer and sleeping bags. I found something in a collection of old manuscripts, something that belongs in a place like this." I flipped a steak, the smoke rising into the dark. "What are you talking about, Max?" He reached into his heavy rucksack and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. "It's a threshold ritual, a way to call out to the things that live in the silence. My research says that houses built on veins like this one can act as amplifiers. We can see them, Elias. We can actually talk to something from the other side." I looked back into the house. In the main hall, I could see the silhouettes of Artyom, Leo, Sasha, and Elena sitting around the table, their laughter muffled by the heavy glass. The contrast between their normalcy and Max's obsession felt jarring. "You want to summon a ghost? Here?" I asked. I should have said no. I should have told him to put it away. But the grief of my grandfather's death had left a hole in me, a desperate need to know if there was anything beyond the veil. "Is it safe?" Max offered a thin, unsettling smile. "It's just an invitation. They can't cross the circle unless we let them. Think about it, Elias. One night to prove everything we've ever wondered about is real." I looked at the stag's head through the window. For a second, I thought the amber eyes flickered. Fine y whispered. After we eat. But keep it quiet. I don't want to scare Elena. Max nodded, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. Oh, don't worry. They'll hear us soon enough. The dinner was a tense affair. The laughter that had filled the hall earlier had turned brittle, like dry leaves ready to crumble. We sat around the massive oak table, the only light coming from a few scattered candles and the dim, yellowish glow of our camping lanterns. Outside, the wind had picked up, clawing at the blackened timber of the dacha with long, whistling breaths. Max didn't eat. He sat at the head of the table, his rucksack resting on his lap like a sacred relic. When the last of the plates were pushed aside, he leaned forward, his face half hidden in the dancing shadows. I have a proposal, Max said, his voice dropping into a low, hypnotic register. The air in this house is heavy with history. My grandfather, Elias's grandfather, he knew things. He chose this spot for a reason. I want to see if we can tap into that energy. Max, not this again, Sasha groaned, though she didn't look away. We're here to drink and relax, not play with Ouija boards. It's not a game, Max replied sharply. He reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of items. For thick, black wax candles, a small rusted tin, and a deck of playing cards that looked like they had been soaked in blood and dried over a century. It's a summons, the ritual of the Four Kings. It's an ancient way to open a window, just a small one, to see who is watching us from the trees. Elena gripped my hand onto the table. Her fingers were trembling. Max, I don't like this. The house is already creepy. Let's just put on some music. But Max was relentless. He was a master of the dare, playing on our curiosity and our pride. He spoke of the thrill, the scientific possibility of a breakthrough, and the safety of the circle. Eventually, even Artyom, fueled by his sixth beer, slammed his hand on the table. Whatever, man. Let's see your magic tricks. Show us what you've got. Max didn't waste a second. He stood up and walked to the front door. He opened it, letting in a gust of freezing night air that sent the candle flames into a frenzy. He knelt on the porch and scooped up a handful of damp, pitch-black forest soil, bringing it back to the center of the hall. He poured the dirt onto the floorboards in a small, neat mound. He signaled for us to turn off the lanterns. We did, and the darkness rushed in, thick and suffocating. Max lit the 4 black candles, placing them in a perfect square around the soil. The light was weak, casting our shadows upward, so they loomed over us like giants on the ceiling. From the rusted tin, Max produced 4 long, heavy iron nails. He reached into the deck and pulled out the 4 kings: hearts, diamonds, spades, and clubs. He laid them face up on the mound of earth. Now, Max whispered, we pin the kings to the earth. We give them a body so they can speak. He took a heavy stone from his pocket and struck the first nail. Clang! The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. He drove the nail straight through the chest of the King of Hearts. Clang! The King of Diamonds was pinned. Clang! The King of Spades. Clang! The King of Clubs. Everyone, stand around the square, Max commanded. We obeyed, forming a circle. Join hands. Do not break the chain. Whatever you hear, whatever you feel, do not let go. If the circle breaks, the window becomes a door. We close our eyes. I could feel Elena's pulse racing through her palm. Max began to chant a rhythmic, guttural sound that didn't feel like any language I had ever heard. It felt older, like the grinding of stones or the creaking of frozen wood. For kings I summon thee. By the iron and the soil, show your faces. For kings I summon thee. By the blood and the wood, speak your names. For kings I summon thee. He repeated the phrase 4 times. On the final word, the air in the room suddenly vanished. It felt as if we were in a vacuum. The flames of the candles didn't flicker. They froze, standing perfectly still like orange glass. Then, from the study behind us, the room where my grandfather had died, came a sound that made my soul recoil. A massive, thunderous crash, as if a giant had reached into the house and struck the wall with a sledgehammer. The circle shattered. Elena screamed. Artyom fell backward over a chair, and Max stood frozen, a look of terrifying triumph on his face. It worked, he whispered into the sudden, freezing silence. They're here. The echo of the crash died away, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against our eardrums. We stood in the flickering remains of the candlelight, frozen like statues. Artyom was on the floor, his breathing ragged and fast, while Elena clung to my arm with such force her fingernails bit into my skin. "Max, what the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and metallic. Max didn't answer. He was staring at the doorway leading to the study, his eyes wide and vacant. I reached for the heavy camping lantern on the table and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark like a blade. I led the way, the wooden floorboards groaning under my boots, each creak sounding like a scream in the stillness of the house. We turned the corner into the hall, and the light hit the floor. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was the massive taxidermy stag head. It lay in the center of the hallway, face up. It had fallen from its mount with such incredible force that the wooden plaque had splintered into a dozen jagged shards. The glass eyes, those deep amber orbs, were cracked now, reflecting the lantern light in 1,000 broken directions. Its antlers had gouged deep, ugly ruts into the ancient floorboards. "It's just the deer," Leo breathed, a massive, shuddering sigh of relief escaping him. "The vibrations. Max, when you were hammering those nails into the floor, it must have loosened them out. It's an old house, Elias. Everything is rotting." I looked up at the wall. The heavy iron bolt that had held the stag for decades was still there, but it wasn't just loose. It was bent downward at a sharp angle, as if something weighing hundreds of pounds had hung from it before it gave way. "See, Max," I said, trying to force a laugh to settle the bile rising in my throat. "Your ritual didn't call the devil. It just ruined my granddad's decor. It's physics, man. Just physics." Max walked over to the fallen head. He looked disappointed, almost wounded. He stared at the shattered antlers, then back at the room where the 4 kings were still pinned to the dirt. "Maybe," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction, "maybe the ground here is too dry for a full manifestation." We helped Artyom and Leo lift the heavy head. It felt strangely warm to the touch, though I told myself it was just the heat from the fireplace earlier. We leaned it against the wall in the corner. We tried to make jokes about how the deer couldn't handle Max's chanting, or how we'd have to explain the hole in the floor to the estate lawyers. The laughter was brittle like thin ice, but it was enough to get us back to the table. We sat back down to finish the beer and the food. We blew out the black candles, and for a moment, the normalcy of the weekend seemed to return. The wind outside had died down to a low hum, and the dacha felt like just a house again. "I'm telling you," Artyom said, his confidence returning with every sip of beer. "Next time, Max summons something useful, like a winning lottery ticket or a girl who actually likes your poetry." We laughed, a genuine sound this time. It was the last time any of us would ever feel safe. Without a flicker, without a warning, the overhead light bulb exploded. The sound was like a whip cracking in the room. Simultaneously, the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen stopped. The lanterns on the table didn't just dim. They went out as if the batteries had been sucked dry in a single second. The darkness that followed was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical weight, cold and suffocating, that rushed into our lungs. "Elias, Elena's voice was a tiny, terrified whimper in the black. "I'm here," I said, reaching for my phone. I pressed the power button, but the screen remained black. I tried again. Nothing. "My phone is dead. It was at 80%. "Mine too," Sasha cried. "What is happening?" "Probably the breaker box," Leo said, his voice surprisingly calm. "The surge from the bulb probably tripped the whole system. I'll go check the basement. I saw the box near the cellar door earlier." "Leo, wait," I said, but I heard his footsteps moving away, guided by his own internal map of the house. "Don't worry," Leo called back from the shadows of the hallway. "I'll have the lights back on in 2 minutes. Just stay put." We sat in the dark, listening to the sound of Leo's footsteps receding. We heard the cellar door creak open. We heard him descend the first few steps. And then, we heard nothing at all. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The air in the room began to grow colder, smelling of damp earth and something sweet, like rotting fruit. "Lau," Artyom shouted. "Stop messing around, man. It's not funny." "No," answer came from the basement. I stood up, my skin crawling with a sudden, primal dread. "I'm gonna go look for him." "Artyom, come with me." "I'm not leaving the girls," Artyom said, his voice trembling. "Fine, stay here. I'll be right back." I moved toward the hallway, my hands outstretched, feeling my way along the cold wooden walls. I reached the cellar door. It was standing wide open, a gaping black maw leading into the earth. I stepped onto the porch just outside the kitchen to see if I could see anything through the window, but my eyes were drawn to the old oak tree in the yard. The moon broke through the clouds for a single, haunting second. I saw Leo, but he wasn't at the breaker box. He was swaying gently in the wind, his body hoisted high into the branches of the oak tree. He was hung not by a rope, but by his own glistening gray intestines, wrapped tightly around his neck and the thick limb of the tree. His eyes were wide, frozen in an eternal scream of agony. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had turned to stone. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stood on the porch, my hands gripping the railing so hard the wood splattered splinters into my palms. The sight of Leo, what was left of Leo, dangling from the ancient oak tree like a grotesque ornament, was a memory that burned itself into my retinas instantly. The moon slid back behind the clouds, plunging the yard into darkness again, but the image remained. The glistening, wet ropes of his own body holding him aloft, his feet twitching in the cold wind. I turned and bolted back into the house, my boots thundering on the floorboards. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. "Run! We have to go! Now!" I screamed as I burst back into the dining hall. "Elias? What happened? Where's Leo?" Artyom's voice came from the dark, cracking with panic. "He's dead. Oh God, he's on the tree." I grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her up. "We have to get to the car." "Move." "Dead? What do you mean dead?" Artyom shouted, his voice rising to a shriek. "Elias, stop joking. It's not." Thump! A heavy, wet sound came from the ritual room, the room where the 4 kings were still pinned to the earth. We all froze. A strange, rhythmic scratching followed, like bone dragging across wood. "Max!" I whispered, hoping against all hope that it was just him. I'm right here." Max's voice came from right behind me, trembling. He wasn't in the ritual room. I reached into my pocket and found a spare lighter. My thumb flicked the wheel frantically until a tiny, dancing orange flame bloomed. I held it out toward the ritual room. The light was weak, casting massive, distorted shadows, but it was enough to see. The door to the ritual room, which had been half closed, suddenly swung open with a violent force that cracked the wood against the wall. Standing in the center of the room was a nightmare made manifest. It was a creature of impossible height, its head nearly brushing the 10-foot ceiling. Its body was a sickly, translucent white, like the skin of a deep-sea fish, and it was covered in black spots, some the size of a coin, others as large as a dinner plate. It had no hair, no ears, and no nose. On its face, where there should have been a single mouth, there were three. They were vertical slits lined with rows of needle-thin teeth, and they were all twitching independently. Above them, 6 eyes, small, lidless, and obsidian black, were scattered across its forehead in a jagged row. And as it stepped forward, its ragged shirt tore open to reveal a massive, drooling maw right in the center of its gray abdomen, snapping at the air. The girls began to scream, a high, piercing sound that seemed to delight the creature. It tilted its head, its joints clicking like a bag of marbles. The King of Spades, Max whimpered, collapsing to his knees. He's beautiful. The creature didn't move fast. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, its long, spindly limbs unfolding like a folding chair. It took one step toward us, and the floorboards groaned under a weight that shouldn't have belonged to something so thin. Artyom, get them out! I roared, snapping out of my stupor. I grabbed Elena, sliding my arm around her waist. Upstairs. Go upstairs. Why upstairs? We're trapped there, Artyom cried. But the creature let out a sound, a 3-toned, harmonic shriek from its facial mouths. And he didn't wait for another answer. We scrambled for the staircase, our feet slipping on the polished wood. I pushed Elena ahead of me, my eyes locked on the white entity. It didn't chase us. It simply stood at the base of the stairs, its 6 eyes tracking our movement, its stomach mouth dripping a thick, black ichor onto the 4 cards still pinned to the floor. As we reached the 2nd-story landing, I looked back one last time. The creature wasn't alone. From the shadows of the kitchen, a second pair of long, white hands was reaching out, gripping the doorframe. We sprinted into the first bedroom we hit, my grandfather's old room, and I slammed the door, throwing the heavy brass bolt just as something slammed into the other side with the force of a car wreck. The door groaned under the weight of the thing on the other side. Each blow sent splinters of wood flying into the room, and the hinges began to scream as they were pulled from the frame. I looked around the room, my mind racing. Sasha was curled in a corner, sobbing, while Elena gripped my hand with a strength born of pure terror. Max was gone. He had stayed downstairs, lost in his twisted adoration of the monsters he had summoned. The window, I shouted, pointing toward the heavy glass pane at the far end of the room. We have to jump. It's the only way out. I ran to the window and threw it open. The freezing night air rushed in, smelling of pine and death. I leaned out, preparing to check the drop, but my heart stopped. Below us, bathed in the pale, sickly moonlight, stood a second creature. It was identical to the first, tall, white, and spotted, but its 6 black eyes were fixed directly on mine. It didn't growl. It didn't move. It simply stood there in the fog, its 3 facial mouths pulled back into a wide, jagged grin that stretched from ear to ear. There's another one, I whispered, pulling back into the room. 4 kings. There are 4 of them. They've surrounded the house. A sickening crunch sounded behind me. I spun around just in time to see a long, pale arm burst through the bedroom door. It didn't go for the bolt. It reached out and grabbed Sasha by her hair. She didn't even have time to scream before she was jerked through the splintering hole in the door. The sound of wet tearing and crunching bone filled the hallway. Sasha, Artyom screamed, rushing toward the door, but I tackled him back. She's gone, Artyom. Look, I pointed to the center of the room. In the chaos, I had spotted a small, iron-bound chest under my grandfather's bed. On top of it sat a dusty glass bottle filled with clear liquid and a crucifix tied to the neck. Holy water. My grandfather hadn't been a recluse because of madness. He had been a warden. I grabbed the bottle and bolted out of the room, fueled by a suicidal surge of adrenaline. I didn't head for the stairs. I headed back toward the ritual room on the ground floor, slipping past the third creature that was busy hunched over Sasha's remains in the hall. I reached the ritual circle. The candles were out, but the 4 cards were still pinned to the floor with those heavy iron nails. I unscrewed the cap and poured the holy water directly onto the mound of forest soil and the cards. A sound like 1,000 dying whistles erupted from the shadows. I turned to see the 4th monster, the largest of them all, standing in the kitchen doorway. As the holy water soaked into the threshold, the creature began to hiss and steam. Its white skin turned to charred, blistering black. It let out a horrific, multi-toned shriek and collapsed into a pile of ash and greasy smoke. I didn't wait to see the others. I ran toward the kitchen, hoping to find Max or Artyom. On the kitchen floor, I found Sasha's camera and a pool of blood that led toward the back door. I looked out the window. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the fog into a gray shroud. In the distance, I saw a lone figure walking away into the trees, Max. He didn't look back. He walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, disappearing into the mist as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat on the cold kitchen floor until the sound of heavy engines broke the silence. By 8 a.m., the dacha was swarming with men in charcoal gray suits. They didn't look like police. They didn't have badges. They moved with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, bagging the remains and scrubbing the blood from the floorboards as if it were nothing more than spilled wine. One of them, a man with eyes as cold as the stag's, sat me down and placed a stack of papers in front of me. "Sign here, Mr. Elias," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will state that your friends left early in the morning. You will state that you haven't seen them since. You will forget this house exists. But they're dead," I whispered, my voice cracking. "The things, the kings." "There are no kings," he replied, sliding a pen toward me. "There is only the debt your grandfather owed, and the silence we provide to keep the world sane. Sign, or you'll be the 5th card pinned to that floor." I signed. I'm writing this now in my old journal, hidden in a place they'll never find. My friends are gone, wiped from every record, as if they never existed. Sometimes when the fog rolls in over the city, I think I hear a 3-toned whistle outside my window. And I know that somewhere in that forest, the 4 kings are still waiting for someone else to hammer a nail into the dirt.